Hello, everyone. I see the chat has already started, and one question being if people's audio is working. I'm Omar. I'm the chair of today's event. We're going to wait another minute or two. Hopefully, my droning on here will allow you to test whether or not your audio is working, although it might be that my mic is not working that well. Yes, audio is working. Thank you, Fiona. And I'm going to continue to drone a bit as more people come in, just so that they can make sure that they're in the right place. This is a seminar to launch the TASO report with What Works Children's Social Care, with Neil Harrison, with Charlotte Crane, with our Deputy Director, Eliza Kozman. The way this is going to work is it's a webinar, so I'll give further explanation of what that means as opposed to a normal Zoom meeting if you haven't done that. But it's just gone to, I'm going to wait one more minute. We've got about half the number of attendees in as had registered, so I'm just going to let it run for another minute before I do the formal or proper introductions. So in a webinar, only the speakers can be seen. Those of you who are attendees are automatically muted and cannot be seen. Okay, I'm going to start because even if more people come in, these are the introductory comments. So it's great to see you all here today. As I said, for some of you may have already heard, my name is Omar Khan. I'm the director of TASO, which is the Center for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education. A bit of a long name, you can refer to us as TASO. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of a new report on supporting learners with experience of children's social care in higher education. I hope you can see all of our panelists. We've got a great panel of speakers today. First, you're going to hear from Dr. Eliza Kozman, who is our Deputy Director for Research at TASO. Second, you're going to hear from Dr. Michael Sanders, the Chief Exec of What Works for Children's Social Care. Third, you're going to hear from Dr. Neil Harrison, Deputy Director of the Rees Center at the University of Oxford. And finally, you're going to hear from Charlotte Church, who's a student currently studying a Master's of Research in Behavioral Ecology at the University of Bournemouth. Before we kick off, I will explain the housekeeping points. So as I said, for those of you who have already heard, you are all automatically muted and your videos are off. This is a Zoom webinar as opposed to a Zoom meeting. There are almost 100 of you in the room, so I hope you understand why that's the best way to run this. You will have a chance to ask questions at the end. You should enter those. Well, you can ask the questions now, but they will be answered at the end of people's presentations. You enter your questions throughout the session using the Q&A function. We will not be able to answer questions in the chat box. And while I do encourage you to answer the questions at any point, especially if something comes up that you think of that you might forget by the end, we will have a distinct opportunity, as I said, for questions at the end. I'll try to get through as many questions as possible in the allocated time. So I'll try to keep our speakers to their 10 minutes each. But if you don't get your question answered, please do email us afterwards. I'd also like to let you know that we are recording this session and we'll distribute the recording and presentation slides to attendees afterwards. And that obviously means if you have any colleagues or friends who you think would be interested in the contents of today's webinar, please do share it with them as well. We'll also be after your feedback. So we'll be sending you a feedback form as a What Works Center, as a center committed to evidence. We want to make sure that what we're doing is really having the best impact in the world and that you're all benefiting and participating from this webinar in the best possible way. So please do fill in that feedback form. It'll make sure that this event and future events like it are run as well as possible. So I'm going to now basically hand over to the speakers. As I said, the first speaker is Dr. Eliza Kozman. She's the Deputy Director for Research at TASO. Eliza?
Great, thank you, Omar. I'm also just going to quickly point out, unfortunately, Charlotte Church couldn't make it, and we're much more pleased to have Charlotte Crane joining us as our fourth speaker.
I'm so sorry, Charlotte. I do want to apologize about that, Charlotte Crane. Apologies.
So I'm going to speak first. So I will just take a moment to share my screen with you all, and hopefully this will work and you'll be able to see my presentation. So is everyone able to see that? Brilliant. Okay, then I will kick off. And I'm going to try and keep to time because I know we only have an hour for this presentation. So just briefly before we start, I wanted to give you a little overview as to who TASO are, for those of you who haven't come across us already. So TASO is an independent hub for higher education professionals. We try to be somewhere you can access research, evidence toolkits, guidance, advice on how to do evaluation, and use evidence in your work in HE. We are being set up as part of a consortium, so King's College London, Nottingham Trent University and the Behavioural Insights team are our consortium partners setting us up in our first stage, and we are an affiliate What Works Centre and part of the UK government's What Works movement. We're funded by the Office for Students from 2019 till 2022, but we are an independent, we're setting up as an independent charity in that time. So that's a little bit about who we are. And in terms of what we do, our vision is to eliminate equality gaps in higher education. So anywhere there's inequality, from access through to success, retention, and then what happens on the other side of higher education, we're interested in addressing equality at all of those different stages. And our mission is to do that through evidence-informed practice. So how can we bring evidence and evaluation to bear on those equality gaps that we all care about? So today I have the task of introducing our new report, which we launched today. I'm really excited to have so many of you interested in the report and on the call. It's really quite overwhelming to have such a great response. So I will give a brief introduction to the report and the recommendations from that. I think reflections might have to wait until the Q&A at the end. I also just at this stage want to thank our authors on the report. So that's Miriam Sternal, Jelena Matic and Susanna Hume from across our consortium partners who compiled the report and did the interviews. Also, just a note on definitions before we start. So throughout the report, we refer to learners with experience of children's social care rather than care leavers or care experienced learners. And that's because we're focused not just on learners who have had a time in formal care, but any learner who has had experience of the children's social care system before the age of 18. So a broad group of learners who perhaps have had a social worker or other kinds of interaction, but were not taken into care. And that's because we know that even that group of learners beyond that formal kind of smaller definition face barriers in accessing and succeeding in HE, and we want to encompass that group. So please refer to the report for more of a conversation on that. So what did we do? The report's available on our website, and I do hope you take a look at the details, but to give you a brief summary of the approach that we took. This is an evidence review. So we've included around 57 papers and reports, which delve into the evidence on how best to improve access and success for these children or these learners with experience of children's social care. And these papers were collated via a formal evidence review using Google Scholar and online searches, but also a call for evidence that we ran with the sector last summer to try and really gather all of the most important pieces of evidence we could from across the sector. When we look at these papers, around half of them focus on activities, so actually analysing the effect of different approaches to improving access and student success, and the other half focus more on barriers and facilitators, by which we mean trying to delve into why these learners may face particular barriers and challenges in succeeding in their education, but perhaps not focusing so much on activities to address those issues. To supplement the evidence that we collated, we also conducted 18 in-depth interviews with experts from across the sector. So people from universities working with this group and from charities, researchers, to try and also harness that expert opinion to supplement the written sources that we found. In terms of what that evidence looks like, you can see that the balance is slightly more on the pre-entry side of things. So our 57 papers break down, we've got about more than half of them, which are focusing on pre-entry. So how do we support learners before they get to the point of entering higher education? A smaller number of them focused on post-entry, so only 12 of them are explicitly focused on what happens when learners get into HE. And then we've got around 12 that focus on both parts of that journey, so a smallish number again. But just to give you a taste of how that evidence base is split. And that's just where the evidence lies. That's where we found it. And another snapshot of the evidence we've included is just to flag that the majority of the papers are in fact UK focused. So we did look outside the UK for examples of practice or evidence that we thought would be useful in the UK context and transferable, but actually a really good number are from the UK, which I think is very helpful from the point of view of validity for people like you who are reading our report. So hopefully that really resonates. The other thing that we've done with the evidence is we align with the Office for Students Standards of Evidence, which offers a categorization, a way of breaking down different evidence sources into different types, which allow us to understand exactly what kind of evidence the source is giving us. So the OFS Standards of Evidence have these 3 different categories, which are narrative, empirical, and causal. And I just want to flag that now because this also comes up in our recommendations. It really helps us understand the type of evidence that we have and what lessons we're able to learn from it. So as you can see from this graph, quite a lot of the studies that we found were narrative, which meant that they had a clear narrative or explanation for why a particular activity or approach might be effective in supporting learners, but perhaps that was supported by expertise or research literature rather than testing it empirically. So rather than collecting any data which could show us whether that was supported by the data available. The pink bits on this graph are empirical sources. So you can see we also have a number of these sources that are more empirical. It means that they've been tested. There's some kind of testing and evidence collation going on to see if the activities that were being run are associated with better outcomes for learners. But then the blue dots on top, or the blue bars on this graph here, are the causal evidence sources. And these are the ones which go that next step further. They give us much more robust evidence that says, actually, yes, there's a correlation, but this is a causal relationship. So the activity is causing an improvement in outcomes for learners. And those are the ones that TASO is particularly interested in. And so just to make that clear up front, we're lacking a little bit on that front here, and you can read more about those definitions in the report. So to come to our findings and recommendations, as I've just described, we are lacking causal evidence. When we look across the piece here, we do need more of those more robust causal evidence studies to give us a better understanding of actually which activities are the punchiest and the most effective at supporting these learners. And one of our recommendations is that collaboration would actually be really valuable as a way of building up bigger numbers of students to include in these studies, evaluation expertise, and just more firepower to bring this question, to bring more focus to this question of developing more causal evidence on how to support the students. So that's really one of our key recommendations from the report. Our second recommendation is around the need for HE providers to work more closely with external authorities, local authorities and virtual schools. And this is a really clear recommendation from both the evidence that we reviewed, but also from the interviews. And when we see collaboration happening, it's associated with better outcomes for learners. Learners are less likely to fall between the cracks between these different bodies and get more and better wraparound support. So we really think there's an important avenue there to support more and better collaboration of this sort in the sector. Our third recommendation is related to this idea of collaboration, but specifically focusing on the impact of virtual schools. So virtual schools exist within local authorities across England, and their networks of education practitioners and social care experts who are there to lobby and advocate for children with experience of social care who require extra support to succeed in their studies. And where we look at the evidence on this, we see there is a correlation between this kind of activity and better outcomes for learners, but it's really difficult to understand to what extent that's due to the effect of virtual schools or differences between local authorities. And what that means is it's tricky for us to identify best practice and then scale that and make sure that as many young people across the country are benefiting from it. So we really recommend more work here to understand the effect of virtual schools, but also to build more and better implementation and process evaluation, which means delving under the surface to identify the most effective parts of practice. in this intervention. Similarly, we think another area for really interesting further exploration is the effectiveness of designated members of staff within HE providers or single points of contact. This comes out very strongly from our interviews, but also from the published papers. That single point of contact you can provide wraparound and tailored support for learners appears to be really valuable, but more monitoring and evaluation is needed to understand how that works and how we can scale that and do it most effectively. Just touching on the idea of intersectionality, which I think comes out really strongly from the report, we also see that these learners face just so many other barriers to succeeding in their education. And we know that these learners are more likely to access HE when they're older and to be mature learners. So that's an additional facet to their education experience, which really we need to link better the support we're providing for children, learners with experience with children's social care and mature learners in the HE context. And similarly, there's a gap. We know these learners are more likely to face mental health challenges. So how can we wrap around support to address all of those challenges that they're facing in the most effective way? Another key recommendation from the report is around understanding and improving our definitions of these learners. And I think Neil will speak much more about this later. But I think, as I've already touched on, this is a thorny issue, and we all want to make sure we're targeting and supporting the learners who most need our support. So how do we make sure the data is in place for us to do that? And finally, it's really important that these learners' voices are included in how we run our research and evaluation, how we interpret them and how we disseminate them later. And so we want to bake that into all of TASO's research, but particularly on this issue, we think it's really, really important. So that's a very brief summary of the reports and our recommendations. We'll have more of a chance to discuss it later. Please do download the report and mull it over yourself. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and hand over to the next speaker, or back to Omar.
Thank you, Eliza. Thank you for summarizing the report and sticking to time. We've now got actually almost 150 people in this event, so it's great to have you all here. Welcome to all of you. I'm now handing over to our next speaker, who is Michael Sanders from What Works Children's Social Care.
So for the first time in history, I managed to share my screen on the first attempt, and in so doing lost the ability to unmute myself. So I hope everybody can see my slides. Thank you to colleagues from TASO for inviting me to be here. So I think this is a really important report, and I'm just going to share very quickly my thoughts and reflections on it. So just by way of a quick introduction, What Works for Children's Social Care is one of TASO's sister What Works centres. We're also a member of the What Works network, and our focus is on achieving the best possible outcomes for young people with a social worker through rigorous evidence. So we care about this cohort of young people who have had a social worker, who have a social worker, and we care about all of their outcomes. So we care about their outcomes within children's social care, but also whether or not they progress to higher education and are able to thrive in life across a number of different domains, which is, nice, easy, small task to try and manage. Access to higher education is important to us because access to higher education is something that should be available to all who would benefit from it. I think that's probably a reasonably uncontroversial statement. I would personally go further and say it should be available to anybody who wants it. So if you are incredibly affluent, nobody asks you, are you going to really benefit from doing this philosophy degree? They just say, it's part of your life, is a rite of passage. So I think that to the extent that rich people are able to do frivolous things with their early life, I think that people who aren't rich should be able to do frivolous things with their early life as well. That's what equality should look like. But that may be a more controversial opinion. Young people with a social worker are no different, and their ability to access the professions, which higher education is very often a route through to, is absolutely vital, because without people with social care experience, without people with care experience in those professions, it is difficult for those professions to adequately support and understand and develop policies and practice in a way that actually helps those the next generation of young people with those characteristics to come through. So it's not just about the young people or the indeed slightly less young people in the case of mature learners who are benefiting from going to higher education themselves. It's about building a system and a society that can benefit the next generation as well. I think it's really important to bear that in mind. Young people with a social worker, particularly people who need care, are more likely to experience homelessness in early adulthood. They're more likely to experience periods of unemployment and other adverse outcomes in their adulthood. And we might expect that going to higher education, not just as a sort of good thing in and of itself, might help to guard against other adverse outcomes. That's certainly that's my theory of change. I can't point to a good RCT on it, but that's what I think happened. Neil is laughing because he says there are no good RCTs, Michael. But anyway, on the topic of this report, I'm really pleased, and I can't say this enough. We're not just looking at care leavers or young people with experience of having been care, but all young people with experience of children's social care. This includes young people who've been the subject of a child in need plan or the subject of a child protection plan. These young people have remained living at home with their parents, and so they don't have the status of corporate parent. And in that sense, you might argue, or some might say, that the state sort of overlooks those people because they're still in the care of their parents. But the challenges that they face in life and the support that they need in their education is no less real than care leavers, but actually in many cases, the support they receive from the state in the form of being the focus of widening participation, of having personal advisors and support in leaving care, is actually less. So we might say that actually this is an overlooked group of young people, and I'm really pleased this report doesn't overlook them and highlights the need to look at them. Because there are, from the report, Eliza's already said, there are some encouraging findings around the provision of mentoring and peer support, and reason to hope that the provision of or access to social capital can make a difference. That's obviously very encouraging to see things. And the recommendations also point to a clear need to join up local authorities and higher education providers and sort of everybody who's working with this group of young people to try and best support them. And that's something that at What Works for Children Social Care, we would be really delighted to be a part of, and really keen to see more research in how we can actually do that. So it is very easy, particularly as an ex sort of Whitehall person, to say, we just need more joined up behavior in the sector and that'll solve it. But actually how you do that joining up and the way in which it's executed and the way that it persists and sustains over time is, it's a very nuanced thing. And I think we can benefit from having research that looks really into the granular detail of what is the best way for us to be working together to not just surround young people with a cacophony of voices, all of which are saying you should go to higher education, but to sort of perhaps distill that message in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're being shouted at by hundreds of professionals. So I think there's a lot to be done in that area. In terms of what's next, I've got some thoughts. So there is a clear need for more evidence, and nobody will be surprised to hear 2 What Works centres and an academic saying more research is needed. That sort of says I try to have a mug around here somewhere which has more research is needed. I can just hold up for emergency situations. It is great to see TASO looking at this, and we want to be helpful at What Works for Children's Social Care, however and whenever we can. But it's really important that we recognise this isn't just a research task. Ultimately, all that What Works centres can do is look at interventions that other people have come up with and work out whether or not they're making a difference. We can't. It's not our place really, and certainly not our jobs to come up with those interventions. I think we all need to think about how we can better support the wider cohort of young people who had a social worker. That means that schools, higher education providers, local authorities, all of us have a duty and an incumbency on us to help to improve access, not just through outreach and getting people who have the grades to go to university to go, or to higher education, sorry, but to also improve the grades of those young people as well, because that's the number one barrier that people are facing. Like, you can give people all the peer support if they want and mentoring you want, but if they don't have the grades to go to university or higher education, then they won't be going. And I think that, Eliza touched on this as well, the sort of need for more intersectionality, and to recognize that not only are young people who have had a social worker who've been in care more likely to go to university when they are older, so they're intersecting with mature students, the state intervenes in the family life of people who are from lower income families a lot more than it intervenes in the lives of people who are from higher income families, and it intervenes across racial lines in a way that is quite starkly imbalanced. And so there is a young person with a social worker isn't just a young person with a social worker and that's all that's going on. They are more likely to have experienced other forms of disadvantage, deprivation, and sort of other things in their life. And so we need to make sure that whatever response it is we are thinking of, we're not just viewing these people as lower income or from a group that experiences racism or just social care experience, but that actually lots of these young people will fit into multiple of those categories. As I say, it's not just a responsibility of research, and I don't think it's just responsibility of HEPs, schools, local authorities. I think there is a need for there to be greater funding and greater focus at a national level in this area. For example, through expanding the role of the virtual schools, which currently only look at the educational attainment of young people who have been in care, so people who are in care or have recently left care. And so expanding their mandate to look at a broader cohort and to consider what happens after the age of 16 a lot more would be, I think, a good and sensible starting point. So that's those are just sort of my very rapid reflections. I hope rapid enough and what hasn't cut me off. And so I will now yield the floor.
Thank you, Michael. No, that's excellent. You're both on time, and you've got some positive notes you'll see in the chat, kind of affirming a lot of the points you're making there. I'm going to turn over now to Neil Harrison, who will give another presentation. Apparently, he gave a similar presentation to some of you, but I think I've seen it in advance, and it's really important for getting some of the data as well that on learners with children in social care. So, handing over to Neil.
Thank you, Amar. Sorry, I'm just getting my slides to work now. Can everybody see those slides okay? Excellent, okay. So my name is Neil Harrison. I'm a Deputy Director of the Rees Centre at the University of Oxford. The Rees Centre is a specialist research centre focusing on the educational outcomes and life outcomes of children in and around social care system and adults who have had experience of care. Oh, that's interesting. My slides have now disappeared. I don't know what happened there. Let's try that again. That's 30 seconds of my time wasted. Some quick definitional notes just to start. In the terms that I'm going to use them, I'm going to care experience students of any students who've spent any time in care as children. And care leavers being those who were in care on their 16th birthday with a 3-month continuous period. Now, this is important because there was a legal status attached to being a care leaver as opposed to care experienced. And a lot of support follows that status. And so one of the things that we increasingly understand is that the wider group of care experienced students may actually have higher levels of disadvantage in higher education than the care leaver group because of the additional support that they're receiving through their local authority. So that's just something to bear in mind as I'm going through. So just to start off with some quick facts and figures, there are about 7,000 care experienced students in higher education in England at any one time. That's probably an underestimate for reasons I can go into later if people want me to. But it's a much larger body than most people would probably expect. And one of the things we also now understand is that the likelihood of a young person going from care into university is considerably higher than previously stated. So some people may have come across a 6% figure that's been around for a very long time. But actually the latest figures from the Department for Education, which support the work that I did a few years ago, is the figures about 13% of care leavers will go on to higher education by the age of 19. This is still much lower than in the general population, where the equivalent figure is about 43%. So you can see the disparity there. It's absolutely huge. But one of the key things here, and again, this is something that comes out of the report, is that half of all care experienced students are actually aged over 20 when they start higher education. So an important principle to always have in your mind is they tend to go a bit later. And there are some very, very good reasons for that, but it's important when we're thinking about the policy and practice implications for what it means to support care experienced students. And if you do a bit of number crunching around that, what that means is about somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all care experienced people will access higher education at some point in their life. And obviously the data going back to people who are now in their 50s and 60s and so on is much more sketchy than what we have for people now in their 20s. But again, this is a lifelong endeavour for some people who are returning to higher education for the first time, perhaps in their 50s. So what I'm going to talk about in my very quick 10 minutes is to focus on accessing higher education rather than the support that's available during higher education, because 10 minutes isn't very long and I've got a lot I could cover. So this little chart here is from a report I did a few years ago. And the percentages on this chart represent the proportion of these groups going on to higher education by the age of 23. And what we can see is that there, on the left-hand part of the graph, there is a big disparity between the 43% of the general population going into higher education and the 12% of care leavers going into higher education. And the middle part of the graph, those who receive free school meals, as another measure of disadvantage, a different disadvantaged group. On the right-hand side, though, what you can see is if we only look at those who got 8 or more GCSEs when they were 16, that the disparities nearly disappear. And what that's telling us is that the major impediment, as Michael touched on a second ago, to care experienced people accessing higher education is the qualifications that they have. And one of the fallacies I think about current thinking in this area is that there is a large pool of care experienced young people at the age of 18 who are qualified to university who choose not to go for whatever reason or are unable to go. There are some, undoubtedly there are some, but the key determinant is what has happened to them earlier in the education system. We know from the work that Claire Crawford did a few years ago that most inequality is baked in by the age of 16 in terms of HE participation. So what that means is we need to think, when we're thinking about higher education access, we also need to think about GCSEs. And I'm not being very mechanistic and reductionist here about it's all about the qualifications. But what we know is that the GCSEs are a springboard to what happens next. They are qualifications, but they're also part of a narrative for young people about what they can do, what they can expect from life. And so we need to think about some of the things that are going on and that contribute. Now, we know that the nature of the care placement is very, very important. Work that my colleagues in the Rees Centre have done have demonstrated the importance of the care placement. And also school stability. We know that children in care are much more likely to change school, much more likely to be subject to fixed term exclusions and other educational disruption. We also know, because of the nature of the trauma that they've experienced earlier in life, that they're much more likely to have identified mental health needs and to have identified special educational needs as well. Perhaps more controversially, or not controversially, but things that aren't thought about, the importance of the future expectations that the young person has about themselves and how they influence the importance they place on GCSEs, and how they engage with school, and importantly, how those expectations, the young person's expectations, are forged around the expectations of the adults that work with them, whether that's foster carers, teachers, social workers, or others. And then finally, there are the other educational inputs that are being made by the school, by the virtual school, by charities, potentially by universities, and the importance of those in that pre-16 period as well. And so what I'm wanting to suggest is that there are 3 excellent opportunities for universities to intervene in this process, focusing either on mental health or on the expectations of young people, or on the actual educational inputs that they're able to make. And that would be one pathway to improving the proportion of young people going into higher education. There are also 2 particular groups that we know have got a lower than average propensity to go on. The first of those are care experienced young people who have got mid-range GCSE results. So perhaps 3 or 4 good passes, or they've got 5 or 6 good passes, but they're missing English and maths. And we increasingly know that those are particularly important. And what we think is happening here is that they are not getting access to level 3 courses. And that's A-levels and BTECs and other things that are traditional pathways into higher education, because schools and colleges prioritise the criterion of having 5 good GCSEs as an entry point at that point. So there are questions about access there. There are questions about the information, advice and guidance that young people have access to at the age of 16. We know that a care experienced young person with mid-range GCSEs is less likely to go on to higher education than a peer who is not care experienced. The other group are those who have higher level GCSE results, but they also have mental health issues or long-term illnesses associated with care. We know from qualitative research work that they are concerned about the support they're going to receive around their disability, mental health issues and illness and so forth, particularly in the switch from child to adult services, but also about the concerns they have about maintaining their accommodation, disruption to their accommodation, their ability to cope with the stresses of higher education and so on. So there are two particular groups that need intervention and support there. And then importantly, the question I posed here is what about the rest? And an important tenet to work from here is that many young people in the care system are simply not in a position to do as well as they might do when they're 16 or 18. There's an awful lot going on in their lives. There's disruption in the family, there's social disruption, there's a disruption in the schooling. There are mental health issues for many of them. And so we need to have an approach to this question that accepts that many of them will not be in a position to go to higher education at 18 or 19, but they might be at 20, 22, 26 or 35. And so we need to think about the routes that let people back into higher education a bit later on. So vocational qualifications, clearly very important. Care experience students are more likely to make use of the access to higher education diplomas offered by further education colleges, and also work-based learning routes, things like foundation degrees and so on. And so there's something there about if we want to be serious about access for this group, we need to be serious about those alternative routes into higher education as well. So I'm going to conclude now with just my 7 steps to what we should do to make things better, to increase the numbers. I was hoping to have a little animation here, but I've run out of time to do it. So you'll just have to listen to me saying it instead. The first and by far away the biggest gain is if we can improve the GCSE attainment for children in care, we will increase the number going on to higher education. That is by far the biggest game in town. One way of doing that is to support their learning through the adoption of trauma-informed and attachment-aware approaches in schools. We know that that's one approach to supporting children in the care system, children on protection plans and other children in the in-need group. We also know, as I said earlier, that we need to raise the expectations of these key adults, because the expectation of the adults gets transmitted to the expectations of the young people. And I've lost count of the number of care experienced young people who tell me that some professional at some point in their time has told them they're more likely to go to prison than to university. This probably isn't true, and even if it was, you can imagine the impact that has on the expectations that those young people can have. My fourth step is to work out what's going wrong for this group of mid-range GCSE attainers, to make sure that they're getting the best post-16 pathway they can, and they're not just ending up retaking their GCSEs or doing a level 2 vocational qualification that won't lead them to higher education. Step 5 is to improve the mental health transitions into higher education, to make those very explicit for young people. Step 6 is to end a postcode lottery in higher education support between different local authorities. We know that what a student is offered depends a great deal on the local authority that they happen to be attached to. And we know that there are very, very different local authority participation rates in higher education. And then step 7 is building these stronger second chance pathways into higher education for those care experienced people who are not able to access at the traditional age. So that's the end of my little session. I hope that's been helpful. There's some references to prove I didn't make it all up. And happy to answer any questions a bit later on.
Thank you, Neil. Now on to our last presenter, which is Charlotte Crane. And apologies for getting your name wrong on the first introduction. You're welcome, Charlotte.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Charlotte, and this is my first ever time doing something like this, so please be gentle with me. I just want to say, in the previous 3 presentations, it's absolutely amazing. I got goosebumps about how much that really, those categories touched on me, and hopefully I can show you a little bit about that with my talk. So I've just recently graduated with a first in ecology and wildlife conservation at Bournemouth University, and I'm currently studying a research master's on primate behavioural ecology. And of course, I am a care experience learner, which is why I'm talking to you guys today. So as we've heard, we all know that the percentage of care experience learners that go on to higher education compared to the national average is ridiculously small. And so I thought I'd begin by sharing a little bit about my background and a couple of my experiences to kind of highlight some of the reasons that me and so many others find it difficult or impossible to access higher education as an option. And then I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about luck. So I've always loved learning, and luckily I've been quite good at it. I found it as an escape from the difficult home life that I had, and I ended up going to a grammar school for the first part. But actually, once I started getting involved with care and I got moved into care, it all sort of got turned upside down. I did lose my focus. I had a lot of mental health issues, and all of that change ended up meaning that I got kicked out of my school, and I ended up in a PRU, a pupil referral unit. And that was throughout my secondary education and for my GCSEs as well. So the impact that care had on my school life was immense, especially as the kids that I was living with didn't have those same focuses that I did or the enthusiasm with school. My typical day, I'd get home from school, I'd have to have meetings with my support workers, I'd have to cook my own food, I'd have to deal with all of the drama that was going on in the supported living, worry about my family situation before I could even think about doing stuff like homework. A couple of anecdotes, most normal like households, if there's a student that's got an exam the night before, there will be like sort of a calm and quiet and considerate environment. But the night before my maths A level, there was a massive party going on in the room above me. So there was like doof, doof, doof till 5 a.m. With people knocking on my door all night. I've also had my laptop stolen twice in my residence, that by other residents. And normally in the home that I've been in, there's only been like one household computer. And quite often, in a couple of different houses that I was in, as punishment, if one kid was naughty, then the whole of the internet would get turned off. So as you can see, this is a really unhealthy home learning environment that lots of care kids have to deal with, on top of the stresses of school life. But I did make it through them, despite being in the category that spent some extra years doing so. I didn't really know what I wanted to be at the time, and I do want to highlight there was a big difference for me from the help that I got from my social services before I knew what I wanted to be and after I knew. Before, I was very much pushed into, okay, get into benefits, get onto the housing system, and just stay down that route and not focus on education, even though I had really good results. But luckily for me, I decided at 18 to spontaneously drop everything and spend all of my life savings, which was only £1,000 at the time, on a one-way trip to India for 6 months, despite the worries of my social workers. But it was amazing. Yay, India. And I had the greatest time. And I met a crazy monkey lady who told me I could work with monkeys for the rest of my life. And well, 6 years later, I'm doing a research master's on monkeys. So life really does change in an instant. But my life isn't like a blueprint for success for all care leavers. So many aspects of my success has been down to luck. I really was one of the lucky ones. I was lucky that I was good at stereotypical education, and also that I went to a wicked PRU that did give me the help and support that I needed, the one-to-one help, and also picked up on my learning difficulties and my special educational needs. I was lucky that I found my dream career path on my own through travel, so that I could push that onto my social workers, and show that determination so that they can help me. I was lucky that I went to the uni that I wanted to go to, Bournemouth Uni, had my dream course. And on top of that, had the best care leavers bursary that I have ever seen. Just a little side step. They offered me it's a £16,000 care leavers bursary over 3 years, which is absolutely insane. And that was that was the main reason that I went to Bournemouth University, because money is a huge stressor for someone who has no one to fall back on, which care experienced students often have. I would say one of the biggest things that I was really, really lucky to have was I was lucky to live in Sutton. I was lucky to be under the Sutton Leaving Care team that have an amazing higher educational scheme. They have a dedicated education officer who's amazing and knows all there is to know, so social workers can go to that, and she helps me every step of the way. But also they pay for my rent and my bus throughout my university degree, which has made such a difference, and actually was the difference in between me coming to university and not. And I want to cry about how much it means and still means, because they are supporting me through my masters as well, which is absolutely incredible. And I know that not every local authority offers this. So these things are the things that really, really made a difference. And I am so, so lucky to have had them all. But unfortunately, like so many others are not so lucky. And the inconsistencies that different care kids get offered is astronomical. Other unis don't do the same bursaries. And it was certainly the deciding factor, like I said, that made me go to Bournemouth University. It meant I was able to stay out of debt and live my student life, but also able to do the things that I've watched other kids do that I'd never been able to do before, like go on field trips. I was able to go to Costa Rica as part of my course, which my bursary paid for. Other boroughs don't offer the same higher education packages as Sutton did, which would have left me worrying about rent. To go from being on housing benefit and paying hardly anything and being in that benefit system to then going potentially to move to a different place and then have to pay like £500-600 plus per month rent would not have been a risk that I would have been willing to take. And I know so many others that are in the same boat as that. And other kids may not fit into that stereotypically academic box, and they don't have the help and support around them to show them the different paths that they can take into higher education. Now, I'm the care, an ambassador for my university. And there are over 50,000 courses in the UK alone. And ecology and wildlife conservation is a perfect example of one of the more wacky ones. And I think so many people, even social workers, think that it's just the subjects that you take into school. And so if you struggled with them, it's hard to see higher education as an option for that. And luckily, so many kids fall into this categories and slip through the cracks, and it's heartbreaking. And I see it a lot being the care leaver ambassador. So why am I here, and what am I trying to prove here? So I guess I am here as evidence to prove to all of you guys what can be achieved by care experienced learners if we're given the right, consistent help and support from education bodies and local authorities. But I'm also here to plead to you guys that if anyone is out there who's listening who does have the power, then to help my friends and the others that are in the same boat as me and have the same backgrounds of got the same kind of grades, the same kind of drive, but are just unfortunate enough to live in different areas or want to go to a different university or have these silly little things that are based on luck, because this is people's lives, and I believe it should never be down to luck. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Charlotte. I struggle to believe that's the first time you've presented, because you did such an amazing job. I mean, you were inspiring, and it was an amazing personal story, but you also presented it extremely well and extremely effectively. So thank you for that. And there's tons of comments in the chat if you want to read about how inspiring you are. I mean, literally scores of them. So thank you for joining us today. I think your final point. Go ahead. No, please come in.
That was really, really nervous. So thank you so much, guys.
Yeah, no, I mean, I fluffed your name at the outset, so obviously you've done a better job today than I have, and I've presented hundreds of times. So, and I'm supposedly Dr. Khan here. So moving to the sort of comments and questions, I just wanted to give a chance, and also to link, I think Charlotte's last point there around luck really does resonate both with the report, with Neil's presentation, with Michael's presentation, and actually quite a lot of the questions, because the questions, a lot of them are like, how do we ensure that our local authority gets better support? Or why is it that, Charlotte and Sutton got such effective support? Why are some virtual schools doing better than others? Are some going to 18? I have to be honest, this is not an area of expertise, but maybe Neil or Michael want to come in on that question of virtual schools. So I think that specific question I'm going to put to Neil, which is how do you engage better local authority in virtual schools if there's pushback from them? But if any of you want to come in on the sort of general point too of the kind of luck or postcode lottery or randomness and how we can better improve that. So I'll turn to Neil first though. Yeah, and maybe also specifically this question on virtual schools. You've seen them in the chat and maybe comment on that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think Charlotte's absolutely right. There is a large degree of luck, and we know that that's the case because as I said earlier, local authorities have very different HE participation rates, and it isn't predicted just by demographics or how rich or poor the area is. There's something else going on, and we don't really understand what that is yet. And that's something that, as a researcher, I'm really interested to find out more about. I think with virtual schools, one of the things to remember, firstly, is they're very new. They were only put in place in 2014, so they're still finding their feet in organisational terms. I know that in that 7 years feels like a long time, but actually to work out from scratch what you're supposed to do is quite tricky. I've been a governor of a virtual school myself, and sort of seeing how that plays out and trying to work out the best way of dealing with this very strange sort of brief that they're given. But the important thing is that the only statutory part of the virtual school is the head. And so some virtual schools are little more than the virtual school head. Others have a very large staff team, 10, 15 people, with particular briefs to be able to help different groups of students, different age groups, and so on. So there's something there about the resourcing. There's also something about the status that the virtual school has in its local authority, and in particular the relationship it has with its schools. If we had a bit more time, I'll tell you a rambling anecdote about some of the virtual schools that I've worked with over the last few years. But some of them are in a much stronger position to be able to support young people than others, and that may be through no fault of their own or of the staff that are in those organisations. So I think Charlotte is absolutely right. There is a high degree of luck involved in this, and that shouldn't be the case. We shouldn't be saying to our most vulnerable young people, it depends whether you're lucky or not. That should never be.
Yeah, just to build up on that, maybe I'll turn to Michael and Eliza or Charlotte. Like, is there a case then for there being more national policy here? I mean, the specific question in the chat is national bursaries rather than just having individual universities choosing, making it a national policy that all universities have bursaries for this target population.
If I could, I think that potentially that could be a way to do it, but then you kind of, there's no way that they'd be given £16,000. So actually, by having some universities that are offering more than others and some that are better than others, it does mean that you can have that choice to go to a university that does give that really good support, rather than my worry is that if there was a national policy, it would only be like £1,000 or £2,000, which obviously would be very different to what I received.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to come in?
So I think I agree with what Charlotte was saying there. I also think that the amount of the bursary is actually, it kind of signals it's not just about the money, it also signals about the extent to which the university takes it seriously. So if we give you a bursary to go to X university that's the same as Y university, but X doesn't really care about you once you arrive and doesn't have anything there to support you, then realistically, like, yeah, that's bad, right? So part of Charlotte's experience is not just about if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's not just about the bursary, it's about the way the institution supports you. In the postcode lottery issue, like, I think there is a space for national policy, but I also think like it's very difficult to overstate the amount of things that a local authority children's services department is responsible for. So you've got every sort of child who is like unborn who might potentially be needing social care intervention in the first year of their life, so minus 6 months of being alive, through to 25 years old. You have assessment, you have intervention, you have, so part of that postcode lottery is which of these areas does a given local authority prioritize. And some local authorities prioritize X over Y. And they are in a nationally very difficult funding position. And at the risk of being like overly blunt about this, like if you're a director of children's services, not very many children in my local authority who've been in care go to university. Never gets you on the front page of the Daily Mail. Like child death does get you on the front page of the Daily Mail, and that like will focus your attention. What we end up with, particularly in the funding environment of, let's say for the sake of argument, the last approximately 11 years, is that you revert back to what the Children Act 1989 tells you that you must do, not what you want to do, not what we can do to improve the lives of young people. And that puts us in a quite a cold place in terms
Sorry,
of...
Michael, I'm just gonna, because I just want to make sure there's one question that maybe I'll direct at Eliza as well, but I think is a general one. I think the comments were very favorable to this expanded notion of who we're talking about, not just care leavers. But there is a question here about, are universities, are HE providers going to be capable of capturing that wider definition? And is there what can we do to help providers, HE providers, to capture those data more effectively?
So just to comment on what we learned from the report, it's definitely a challenge. And although many of the interviewees who we interviewed did say that they were seeking to use this broader conception and trying to collect the data, generally they had to be very creative about how they found it. So I think the best practice that we identified was partnering with third sector organisations as a way of bridging that gap. But that speaks to Charlotte's point about this being a lottery, because it depends on existing relationships between providers and those third sector organisations and their capabilities locally. So I think identifying that and scaling that is going to be really key. Although ideally we would see it reflected in a more administrative data source, and that's obviously Neil's ballpark, but we hope that we can support that. And through the report, I think we have very robust recommendations about how that should be supported by government.
Yeah, I think also the point in the report about collaboration between local authorities and HEPs is vital, because the local authority knows who these children are without having to ask them, whereas the universities have to ask.
Yeah, just quickly, Charlotte, I mean, from your local authority, I mean, how many other people in your cohort, friends, kids went on to higher education?
Out of the people that I know, out of everyone that I've lived with in all the different homes and stuff like that, I am the only person who went on to university that I know. I know a couple of people went on to apprenticeships, and I know one person that went on to the army and then did a qualification through the army. But in terms of actually going, I think there are a couple of people who are in it that I don't know, but out of the people that I lived with, none of them.
And that shows that even in a very strong support like you had at Sutton, even there, the numbers coming through are not enough. Just one final question before I wrap up, because we are running out of time, but it came up quite a bit that that people are more likely to be mature learners. So are there any particular effective ways? Because I think a lot of whiting participation teams are more used to contacting younger people. So are there any particular effective ways of contacting mature care leavers or care experienced people? How do we get to these populations? Do we have HE providers doing enough? How are the university initiatives reaching out to them now, and how could they do a better job specifically to reach out to mature learners? Any answers to that? I see some nodding from Neil and Mike. Well, all of you. So,
I think it's a bit of a gap at the moment. I think that if you go back, I'm quite old, and if you go back into the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of good work in universities working with mature students, but that's kind of declined over time as the youth participation rate has risen. The importance of the mature student market has dropped, and so I think universities have kind of forgotten a little bit about how to do it. The other thing to bear in mind here, when we're not talking about sort of for the most part, we're not talking about very mature students. We're talking about people up to the age of, let's say, 25 or 30. So the local authority should still have that information. There's a case to be made for better partnerships with further education colleges, because a lot of the re-engagement with education that care experienced people will have is with their FE college. So again, that relationship between university and the local FE colleges is also really important, but it also needs some inventiveness as well, working with employers, for example. So we know, for example, that a lot of care experienced students want to go into, and maybe already are working within, the caring profession. So they may be working in youth work or the healthcare system or in social care in some way. So it's also about kind of thinking through the pathways and trying to work out where those points are. I don't have a solution, but I think it's crying out for some really smart thinking.
I'm really sorry. It's my fault. I probably let the Q&A go on, but it's we are 1 minute from the end, and I have to wrap up a bit. I want to thank everyone, all the speakers, in particular Charlotte, for sharing her experience. So not just sort of emotionally and personally, but also so effectively and clearly, and highlighting some of the things that need to be done to ensure that she isn't just the only lucky one, but that others like her get through. I mean, I think that's really a tribute to you, Charlotte. But I also want to say to everyone that thanks to all the participants. There are 150 of you on this webinar. I think that shows the interest in this topic and the need for us to see better interventions. We have recorded this webinar, so we will be sending you this as feedback. Please also go to our website and download the report, read the blog and the news story. And if you've got any questions, and I do apologize, we haven't been able to answer all of them, please do email us and we'll try to respond to as many of them as we can. It just leaves me to say thank you to all of you, and to have a good afternoon. And we'll be continuing to do work on this topic, and we're going to make sure that, so in a few years' time, that we have better evidence of what works, so that we have more Charlottes presenting at events like this. I don't know that we'll have more just quite like you, Charlotte, but more people with the sort of success that have converted their luck into success in higher education. So thank you so much.
Thank you.